The lights in the grand chamber of the Galactic Concordat dimmed for a moment before the vote, and in that silence, I heard someone laugh at us. My name is Ethan Marlowe, and I was standing at the small podium reserved for Earth's delegation when the laughter started. It came from the Vashtar section, rows of tall, pale delegates wrapped in ceremonial silver robes, their translator devices humming softly around their necks. Their high delegate, a being named Sozrek Vantal, had just finished speaking about Earth's request to renegotiate mineral extraction rights along our own asteroid belt. He turned to the crowd, spread his long arms, and said the words that would end everything. He called humanity the loudest species to ever crawl out of a gravity well. The chamber erupted in laughter. Not from everyone, but from enough. Enough that I felt the heat rise in my neck. Enough that I saw my colleague Grace Holloway grip the edge of the podium until her knuckles turned white. We were used to insults. We had absorbed them for 30 years, ever since Earth was granted what the Concordat called provisional observer status. It sounded like an honor when we first heard it. It was not an honor. It was a leash. Provisional meant we could attend meetings but never vote. It meant every treaty we signed was written by other hands, and we were only allowed to nod along. It meant fleets 1,000 times the size of our own could sit outside our solar system and remind us, without ever saying it directly, that our existence was tolerated rather than respected. Sozrek Vantal was not finished. He looked directly at our section, his silver eyes catching the chamber light, and added one more sentence, almost gently, the way someone might say something devastating while smiling. He said perhaps it was time the Concordat reconsidered how long a species should remain useful before its usefulness expired. The room went quiet after that. Even the delegates who had laughed seemed to sense they had crossed into something colder. Grace did not respond. I did not respond. Protocol required us to sit and absorb it, because a raised voice from Earth's delegation would be reported back home as an escalation, and escalation was the one thing we had been taught never to risk. I remember looking at the domed ceiling of the chamber, painted with the crests of 40 founding species, and thinking that Earth's crest was smaller than all the others, placed near the bottom edge where newer members were displayed. I remember thinking about my grandmother, who used to tell me that dignity was not something you asked for. It was something you decided you already had, whether anyone else agreed or not. We left the chamber in silence. Grace did not speak until we were inside the secured transport back to the embassy, and even then, all she said was that she needed to file the session report before the encryption window closed. I nodded. I had my own report to write. Neither of us mentioned the laughter. Neither of us mentioned the sentence about usefulness expiring, though I knew we were both turning it over in our minds like a stone with a sharp edge. That night, long after Grace had gone to her quarters, I sat alone in the embassy's small communication room. The walls were thin, painted the color of old parchment, chosen years ago by some designer who thought it would make visiting delegates feel at home. It never worked. Nothing about that station felt like home. It felt like a waiting room. At exactly 2 in the morning by station time, my private channel chimed. It was a priority connection from Earth, routed through the Unified Assembly's private relay, the kind of connection that only opened for messages that mattered. I expected instructions. I expected a careful diplomatic paragraph telling us to smooth things over, to apologize for causing offense simply by existing, to request a quiet correction to the record. Instead, the message contained a single word: enough. I stared at it for a long time. There was no signature, no further explanation, no formatting of any kind. Just that one word, sent from the highest levels of our government, at an hour when every other message from Earth usually came wrapped in caution and careful phrasing. I read it 3 times before I understood that something had already been decided, somewhere far above my position, long before Sozrek Vantal ever opened his mouth in that chamber. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window of my quarters, looking out at the slow-turning shape of the station's outer ring, watching cargo shuttles drift between docking bays like fireflies. I thought about all the years we had spent being patient. I thought about the treaties we signed because we were told refusal meant conflict, and conflict meant the end of everything we had built since first contact. I thought about how many times I had personally sat in rooms where humanity was discussed, as though we were a variable to be managed rather than a people to be respected. Somewhere in the quiet hours before the station's artificial dawn, I began to understand that the word on my screen was not a warning. It was an announcement. Earth had reached its limit, and whatever came next would not ask permission from the Concordat, from the Vashtar, or from anyone who had ever laughed at us in that chamber. I did not know yet what form it would take. I did not know that within a day, every treaty bearing Earth's signature would be gone, or that the quiet, careful diplomat sitting beside me in that transport would soon become one of the most important voices in the galaxy. I only knew that something had shifted, deep and silent, like a tide pulling back before a wave no one else could see coming. At the time, I thought the hardest part of that day was standing in the chamber and absorbing an insult without response. I was wrong. The hardest part was walking back into that same chamber less than 48 hours later, when every species that had laughed would finally understand what it meant to underestimate a people who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much weight silence could hold. I finished my report before sunrise. I sent it through the secure channel, along with a short personal note asking for confirmation of what the single word meant. No answer came. Instead, 3 hours later, a new bulletin arrived on every screen in the embassy, unencrypted, meant to be seen by every delegation on the station at the same moment. It was a formal notice from the Unified Assembly of Earth, citing an old and rarely used provision buried deep within the founding charter of the Concordat, a clause almost every species had forgotten existed. It stated that any signatory nation could withdraw from every treaty tied to its membership at once, if it could demonstrate a breach of what the charter called the Dignity Clause. Beneath the notice was a timestamp. The withdrawal would take effect at midnight, station time, that same day. I read it twice, then looked out the window again, at the same slow-turning ring, the same drifting shuttles, and for the first time since arriving at that station, I felt something other than caution. I felt the quiet, steady weight of a decision that could not be taken back. Grace found me still sitting there when the morning shift began. She read the notice over my shoulder without a word, then sat down across from me, her face unreadable in the way it always was during difficult moments. She asked me one question, and it was the same question I had been asking myself for hours. She asked if we were ready for what would happen after midnight. I did not have an answer for her. I only knew that somewhere back on Earth, people who had spent decades absorbing insult after insult, treaty after unequal treaty, had finally decided that patience without dignity was no longer a virtue worth keeping. Whatever came next, it would not be quiet, and it would not ask the Concordat for approval. It would simply happen, at midnight, without warning, exactly the way every insult against us had happened, without warning for 30 years. This time, the silence would belong to them. The countdown began the moment station clocks rolled past midnight, and within minutes, every screen in the embassy lit up with incoming messages from a dozen different species at once. I had never seen anything like it. Grace Holloway stood beside me in the Situation Room, her arms folded, watching a wall of monitors as request after request for emergency contact appeared, each one marked urgent, each one demanding an explanation for what had just happened. The Unified Assembly's withdrawal notice had taken effect exactly on schedule, and with it, every treaty bearing Earth's signature had simply ceased to exist. Trade agreements, resource-sharing arrangements, non-aggression pacts, mutual defense clauses, decades of careful, one-sided paperwork, gone in a single moment, as if someone had reached into a filing cabinet and removed every folder at once. I remember the first call came from the Ilvex Trade Office, a small delegation that handled agricultural exchange between Earth and 3 neighboring systems. Their representative, a soft-spoken being named Doran Ilth, appeared on our screen looking more confused than angry. He asked, quite simply, whether there had been some kind of technical error in the Concordat's central registry, because his systems showed that Earth's food distribution agreements had vanished overnight. Grace answered him herself. She kept her voice level, almost gentle, and told him there had been no error. She explained in careful words that Earth had invoked the Dignity Clause following a public and documented breach of respect during the previous council session. Doran Ilth went quiet for a long moment, then asked what that meant for the shipments already in transit toward his system. Grace told him that Earth would honor any agreements privately negotiated between individual parties, but the Concordat-wide framework no longer applied. He thanked her, disconnected, and I remember thinking that his was the calmest reaction we would receive all day. The next calls were not calm. A representative from the Torvain Compact, one of the larger trading blocks aligned closely with the Vashtar hegemony, appeared on screen already shouting before the connection had fully stabilized. He demanded to know how a provisional species could invoke a clause meant for full members. Grace pulled up the charter text on a secondary display and read the relevant passage aloud, slowly, so there could be no confusion. The clause made no distinction between provisional and full members. It applied to any signatory. Nobody had ever imagined a provisional species would have the political will to use it, and so nobody had ever bothered to write an exception. The Torvain representative did not have a response to that. He ended the call abruptly, and within the hour, 3 more delegations from within his block had also vanished from our approved contact list, likely reorganizing their own trade routes in a panic none of them wanted to admit to. By mid-morning station time, the embassy had become something closer to a command center than a diplomatic office. I was pulled away from routine correspondence and placed on direct communication with Earth, working alongside a small team led by a calm, precise woman named Margaret Coyle, the chair of the Unified Assembly's Foreign Council. I had spoken with her before, always through formal channels, always brief. This time, her voice on the line was different. There was no hesitation in it at all. She told me plainly that the withdrawal was not a mistake, an overreaction, or a temporary measure meant to force a symbolic apology. It was permanent. Earth intended to renegotiate its entire relationship with the Concordat from a position that reflected who we actually were, not who we had been allowed to appear as for 30 years. I asked her what that meant for our safety, since every treaty that had provided even the smallest protection from larger fleets had just disappeared along with everything else. There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected, and then she said something I did not fully understand until later that day. She told me that Earth had never been as unprotected as the treaties made it appear, and that the coming hours would make that clear to everyone watching. I did not have time to ask what she meant, because at that exact moment, a new alert came through from our monitoring station near the edge of our own asteroid belt. A Vashtar mining fleet, operating under what had, until midnight, been a fully legal extraction agreement, was still actively working within the boundary of what had been Earth's protected territory. The moment the treaty vanished, so did their legal right to be there. Their operation, which had been running for years under terms Earth never truly agreed to but had been pressured into signing, was now, in the eyes of the newly dissolved Concordat framework, an unauthorized presence inside sovereign space. I watched the sensor feed with Grace standing beside me, both of us silent as the data updated in real time. The mining fleet had not moved. Their operators likely had not even received notice yet that anything had changed, since most commercial fleets rarely paid attention to political proceedings back at the central station. They were simply continuing their work, extracting resources exactly as they had been doing for years, unaware that the legal ground beneath their entire operation had just disappeared. Within the hour, that would no longer be a quiet detail buried in a diplomatic footnote. It would become the first visible sign, to every watching species, that Earth's withdrawal was not a bluff. A message came through from Colonel Peter Lindquist, whose name I recognized from Earth's Defense Liaison Office, but whom I had never spoken with directly before that day. His voice was calm, in a way that reminded me of Margaret Coyle, steady and unhurried, the voice of someone who had clearly been preparing for this exact moment far longer than I realized. He informed us that Earth vessels stationed nearby, previously restricted from approaching the asteroid belt under the very treaties that had just dissolved, were now cleared to assert sovereign presence in the region. He asked me to relay a simple, formal request to the Vashtar mining operators through diplomatic channels, giving them a reasonable window to withdraw their equipment peacefully. I sent the message myself, watching the timestamp carefully, aware that every second of that exchange would likely be studied later by historians trying to understand exactly how the balance of power in our region shifted in the span of a single day. The response from the Vashtar mining office came back within minutes, confused and defensive. They insisted their operation was fully authorized under existing agreements. Grace responded personally this time, her tone patient but unwavering, explaining that the agreements in question no longer existed as of midnight station time, and that continued operation without renewed authorization would be treated as an unlawful presence within Earth's recognized territory. There was a long silence after that message. I remember watching the clock, counting the minutes, wondering what would happen if they simply ignored us, the way larger species had ignored Earth's objections for decades. Then, almost an hour later, sensor data showed the mining fleet beginning to power down its extraction equipment. Slowly, methodically, without any further communication, their vessels began repositioning away from the asteroid field. I sat back in my chair, feeling something I had not expected. Not triumph exactly, but something close to it. A strange, quiet relief that came from watching, for the first time in my career, a larger species respond to Earth not with condescension, but with caution. Grace noticed it too. She did not smile, because the day was far from over, but she nodded slightly, the way someone does when a difficult first step has been taken successfully. Throughout the rest of that day, similar scenes repeated themselves across every system where Earth had once held treaty obligations. Trade routes that had been guaranteed under Concordat protection were suddenly open to renegotiation. Resource-sharing agreements that had quietly favored larger species for years were simply gone, replaced by nothing, forcing every partner who had relied on them to scramble for new arrangements directly with Earth, on whatever terms Earth was now willing to offer. By evening, the embassy had received formal requests for private negotiation from no fewer than 11 different delegations, each one hoping to secure some version of the access they had lost. Each one now approaching Earth not as a provisional observer to be managed, but as an equal party whose cooperation actually mattered. I remember standing at the window of the Situation Room as the station's artificial evening settled in, watching the slow rotation of distant ships repositioning themselves in response to a single day's events. Grace stood beside me again, quiet, thoughtful, the exhaustion of the day visible in the way she held her shoulders. She said something to me then that I have thought about often since. She said that for 30 years, Earth had been told that our value depended entirely on our willingness to accept whatever terms were offered to us. She said that what we had just witnessed was not aggression, and it was not recklessness. It was simply the moment a species finally understood the difference between keeping peace and keeping silence, and decided it no longer wanted to confuse the two. I did not fully understand the depth of what she meant until the following day, when Margaret Coyle called again, this time with new instructions that made it clear the withdrawal of treaties had only been the opening move in something Earth had been quietly preparing for far longer than any of us in the diplomatic corps had ever been told. Margaret Coyle called the following morning, and this time her voice carried a different weight, as though she were about to hand me something heavier than I was prepared to carry. She told me that within 6 hours, Earth would begin what she called the second phase, and she wanted me to understand it before the rest of the galaxy did, so that when the questions came, and they would come quickly, I would not be caught without an answer. For 30 years, every treaty we signed with the Concordat had included a clause that none of us in the diplomatic corps ever discussed openly, though we all knew it existed. It was labeled, in the dry language of interstellar law, as a provisional species safety limit. On paper, it sounded protective, as though the larger, more established species were simply being cautious with a newer member still finding its footing. In practice, it capped how far Earth was allowed to advance in military technology, in fleet size, in defensive infrastructure, all under the polite justification that a young species needed guidance before it could be trusted with real strength. Margaret told me that Earth had spent every one of those 30 years quietly building far beyond what those limits ever intended, using research and development that never appeared on any Concordat registry, funded through channels that no outside auditor had ever been permitted to inspect. The moment the treaties dissolved, so did the legal basis for those limits, and so did any obligation to keep our progress hidden any longer. I asked her, carefully, how far beyond the old limits we had actually gone. She paused before answering, and when she did, her voice was calm in a way that made the answer feel even larger than the words themselves. She said that Earth's defense capability, kept quiet for 3 decades under the assumption that we would always remain smaller and weaker than everyone around us, was no longer something any other species in the region could safely underestimate. I sat with that information for a long moment before asking my next question, which was whether the Vashtar hegemony understood any of this yet. Margaret told me they did not fully, and that was precisely why the timing of the withdrawal had been chosen so carefully. She said that surprise was the only advantage a smaller species could ever truly rely on, and Earth did not intend to waste it by announcing anything before it needed to be seen. 6 hours later, exactly as she had promised, sensor stations across our sector began registering activity that had never appeared on any previous scan. Defense platforms, positioned in quiet orbits around key points in our system, activated systems that had been dormant, invisible to standard detection methods, for years. I watched the readings update on our screens with a strange mixture of pride and disbelief, because even I, someone who worked closely with Earth's foreign policy, had never known the true scale of what had been built. Grace stood beside me as the data came in, and for the first time since the mockery in the council chamber, I saw something shift in her expression. It was not surprise exactly. It was closer to relief, the kind that comes from finally understanding that a long, difficult silence had actually meant something. She told me quietly that she had suspected for years that Earth was building something beyond what the treaties allowed, though she had never known the details. She said that every diplomat sent to the Concordat had been given the same simple instruction, over and over, no matter how difficult the sessions became. Endure, absorb the insults, sign the unequal agreements, buy time. None of us had ever been told exactly what that time was being used for, only that it mattered more than our comfort in any single meeting. As the day continued, more information reached us, and each new piece reshaped my understanding of what Earth had quietly become, while the rest of the galaxy assumed we were still the same fragile, provisional species that had first arrived at the Concordat's doorstep decades earlier. We learned that Earth had not built its strength alone. Over the years, quiet cooperation had developed between our scientists and several smaller, often overlooked species scattered across neighboring systems, communities who had also been treated poorly by the larger, more established members of the Concordat, though never as visibly as Earth had been. These species, small in population but skilled in areas the larger powers rarely valued, had worked alongside Earth in secret, exchanging knowledge, resources, and eventually loyalty in ways that never appeared in any official Concordat record. Doran Ilth, the same soft-spoken Ilvex representative who had called us confused about the missing trade agreements, contacted the embassy again that afternoon, and this time his tone had changed entirely. He told Grace, in a voice that carried something close to gratitude, that his people had quietly received research support from Earth for nearly a decade, support that had allowed his small, often ignored species to develop agricultural technology capable of feeding populations across 3 systems without depending on Vashtar-controlled supply routes. He said his people had always wondered why Earth extended that kind of help so quietly, without ever asking for public credit or favorable treaty terms in return. Grace answered him honestly. She told him that Earth had learned, long before any of us arrived at the Concordat, that alliances built on quiet trust often outlasted the ones built on public displays of power. She said Earth had chosen to help species like his precisely because nobody was watching, and because a friendship formed without an audience tends to be the kind that holds when it actually matters. I listened to that exchange and thought about how differently the larger species had always treated us, how every gesture from the Vashtar or the Torvain Compact seemed calculated for effect, meant to be witnessed and remembered by the wider Concordat audience. Earth's quiet decade of support for smaller species like the Ilvex had never been performed for anyone. It had simply been done, patiently, without expectation of return, and now that patience was becoming something the larger powers had never accounted for. By evening, the picture had become clear enough that even the Vashtar mining office, still recovering from its earlier confusion, sent a formal inquiry asking whether Earth's sudden military visibility represented a violation of previous safety understandings. Margaret Coyle responded to that inquiry herself, and I was given a copy of her reply before it was sent. Her message was short. She reminded the Vashtar office that the safety limits they referenced had existed only within treaties that no longer applied, since those same treaties had been dissolved following a public breach of the Dignity Clause during a council session witnessed by every delegation present. She added, without any hostility in her wording, that Earth's development over the previous decades had never actually violated those limits in secret defiance, but had simply continued in areas the treaties never had the authority to restrict once withdrawal became possible. I remember reading that message and understanding, for the first time, the full shape of what had happened. Earth had never broken a rule. We had simply waited for the rules themselves to disappear, and had spent 30 years preparing for exactly that moment, quietly, patiently, without ever giving the larger species reason to suspect anything beyond the polite, provisional silence they had grown so comfortable with. Grace found me still sitting at my station long after the embassy's evening shift had ended. She asked if I understood now why Earth had endured so much for so long without ever raising its voice in that chamber. I told her I thought I did, though the full weight of it was still settling in my mind. She said something then that stayed with me through everything that followed in the days ahead. She said that the Vashtar had always assumed patience was a sign of weakness, because in their long history, every species that endured quietly eventually broke under the pressure of humiliation. She said they had never considered the possibility that a species might endure quietly, not because it was weak, but because it was using every one of those silent years to prepare for the moment it would finally choose not to endure anymore. I looked out at the darkened ring of the station, at the distant lights of ships repositioning once again in response to a discovery none of them had expected, and I understood that the mockery in that council chamber had not been the beginning of Earth's story. It had simply been the last insult a patient species had ever intended to accept quietly. What came next, I knew, would not be quiet at all. 3 days after the withdrawal, I received formal instructions to return to the council chamber, and this time I was not going as a junior delegate meant to sit quietly beside Grace Holloway. I was going to stand at the podium myself, because Margaret Coyle wanted someone who had witnessed the original mockery firsthand to be the one who answered it. I remember the walk through the station corridors that morning felt different from every previous visit. Delegations from smaller species nodded to me as I passed, something that had never happened before. A few even stopped to offer quiet words of encouragement, careful not to be seen doing so too openly, since many of them still depended on trade relationships with larger powers who would not appreciate the gesture. Doran Ilth was among them, standing near the entrance to the chamber with 2 other Ilvex representatives, and he simply placed a hand briefly on my shoulder as I passed, saying nothing at all. It was enough. The chamber itself felt different too. The Vashtar section, usually filled with confident, upright postures and quiet conversation before sessions began, was noticeably subdued. Sosrek Vantel sat near the front, his silver robes less immaculate than I remembered, his expression unreadable in a way that told me he understood exactly how much had changed since the last time we occupied that room together. Grace sat beside me at the Earth section, though this time she did not carry the weight of speaking alone. When the session opened and the presiding officer, an elderly being from a neutral species called the Threll, invited any delegation to address the chamber regarding recent developments, I stood before Grace could rise, because I wanted to be the one to speak. I did not raise my voice. I had learned over the previous days that Earth's strength had never come from volume. It came from patience that had finally run its course, and I intended to speak the same way Margaret Coyle had written her message to the Vashtar mining office, calm, clear, and impossible to dismiss. I told the chamber that Earth had not withdrawn from its treaties out of anger, though anger would have been justified after 30 years of unequal terms. I told them we had withdrawn because a species cannot build a lasting peace on agreements signed under the constant threat of humiliation. I reminded the chamber of the words spoken in that same room only days earlier, about humanity being the loudest species to crawl out of a gravity well, about our usefulness eventually expiring. I said those words plainly, without embellishment, because I wanted every delegate present to hear them again, spoken back into the same silence that had once let them pass unchallenged. Then I did something Margaret Coyle had specifically asked me to do, something that surprised even Grace beside me. I opened a data display above the podium, one that had taken Earth's diplomatic corps 3 days to compile, and I began reading a list. It was not a list of Earth's grievances alone. It was a ledger of every documented incident where a smaller species within the Concordat had been treated unfairly under agreements written and enforced primarily by the Vashtar hegemony and its closest allies. Trade terms that favored larger fleets at the expense of smaller producers. Resource quotas that consistently left newer members with the smallest share despite equal contribution. Safety limits imposed on developing species under the guise of protection. Limits that conveniently prevented any smaller power from ever growing strong enough to negotiate as an equal. I read example after example, each one drawn from records that had always existed within the Concordat's own archives, records that no one had ever compiled together in a single, undeniable list before that day. I watched delegates from species I had barely spoken with in all my years on the station shift uncomfortably in their seats. Not because the information was new to them, but because it had never before been spoken aloud in front of everyone at once. Sosrek Vantal rose partway through my reading, attempting to object, claiming the list misrepresented long-standing agreements as exploitation. I paused, allowed him to finish, then responded with a single question. I asked him whether any of the smaller species listed on that ledger had ever been given the opportunity to renegotiate those agreements on equal terms, the way Earth had just done through the Dignity Clause. He did not have an answer. The silence that followed was longer and heavier than the laughter that had once filled that same chamber at Earth's expense. I finished my remarks by stating, plainly, that Earth was not asking for special treatment. We were asking for the same equal standing already promised to every founding member of the Concordat, standing that had been quietly withheld from us under the label of provisional status for 30 years. I said that Earth was prepared to negotiate new agreements, fair to all parties, but only from a position of full and permanent equality, never again as an observer waiting for permission to matter. When I stepped back from the podium, the chamber did not erupt in laughter this time. It erupted in something else entirely, a wave of quiet conversation among delegations who had clearly been waiting for someone to say aloud what many of them had privately believed for years. Within an hour, the presiding Threll officer received a formal request from a small trading collective known as the Renew Assembly, asking to invoke the same dignity clause Earth had used, citing decades of unequal treatment under agreements enforced by the same larger powers. By the end of that session, 2 more species had filed similar requests, each one inspired by watching Earth demonstrate that the clause was not merely theoretical language buried in an old charter, but a real and usable path toward equal standing. I remember Grace leaning toward me as the session adjourned, whispering that we had just witnessed the beginning of something the Vashtar hegemony could never fully control again. The Concordat's entire trade order, built over generations on the assumption that larger species would always hold quiet leverage over smaller ones, was now facing the possibility that every overlooked member might follow Earth's example, one dignity clause at a time. That evening, I received an unexpected private request for a meeting, forwarded through neutral channels, from Sosrek Vantal himself. Margaret Coyle authorized the meeting immediately, though she reminded me, through a brief encrypted message, that Earth would negotiate from strength, not from any desire to make the moment easier for someone who had mocked us in public only days earlier. I met him in a small private chamber near the diplomatic wing, without grace this time, though I knew every word would be recorded and reviewed by Earth's Foreign Council afterward. Sosrek Vantal looked different in private than he had in the chamber, less composed, his usual confidence replaced by something closer to careful calculation. He began by acknowledging, in formal but noticeably restrained language, that his earlier remarks in council had been inappropriate. He said the Vashtar hegemony was prepared to discuss a new framework of cooperation with Earth, one that recognized our full standing as an equal member rather than a provisional one. He asked, almost carefully, whether Earth would be willing to pause its support for the wave of Dignity Clause requests now spreading among smaller species, in exchange for immediate and favorable terms specifically for Earth. I understood, in that moment, exactly what he was asking. He wanted Earth to accept a better deal for ourselves while quietly abandoning the smaller species who were only now finding the courage to demand the same fairness we had just claimed. I thought of Doran Ilth's quiet hand on my shoulder outside the chamber that morning, and I knew what my answer had to be. I told Sosrek Vantal that Earth would welcome a new framework of cooperation, but only one that extended equal standing to every species currently seeking it, not one negotiated privately to benefit Earth alone while leaving others behind. I told him that the entire point of our withdrawal had never been to secure special treatment for ourselves. It had been to prove that dignity, once claimed, could not be selectively granted to only the species powerful enough to demand it loudly. He was quiet for a long moment after that, studying me the way someone studies an opponent they have suddenly realized they misjudged from the very beginning. Then he said something I had not expected. He said that 30 years ago, when Earth first arrived at the Concordat, his predecessors had believed our species would eventually accept whatever terms were offered, simply grateful to have a seat in the room at all. He admitted, quietly, that they had never imagined we would spend those 30 years preparing, patiently and silently, for the moment we would refuse to be grateful for anything less than fairness. I told him that patience and gratitude were never the same thing, and that Earth had simply chosen to wait until fairness was possible, rather than pretend it already existed. He did not have a response to that either. He simply nodded, said the Vashtar hegemony would need time to consider a broader framework, and ended the meeting far more quietly than he had ever spoken in the chamber, where this entire story began. Walking back to the embassy that night, I understood that the reckoning Earth had set in motion was no longer something we could control entirely on our own. It had become something larger, a slow unraveling of an order that had depended, for generations, on smaller voices, never realizing they were allowed to speak at all. 6 months passed between that quiet private meeting with Sosrek Vantal and the day the Concordat finally opened formal negotiations for a new founding charter, and I spent nearly every one of those months, inside conference rooms, transport shuttles, and encrypted briefings, watching the shape of the galaxy shift in ways none of us at the embassy had ever expected to witness in a single career. The wave that began with Earth's withdrawal did not slow down. Within the first month, 7 additional species had invoked the Dignity Clause, each one citing decades of quiet unfairness that had never before been spoken about openly in the chamber. The Vashtar hegemony, once confident enough to mock a provisional species without a second thought, found itself managing a slow collapse of the very trade order it had built its influence upon. Fleets that once patrolled routes under favorable one-sided agreements now faced renegotiation with partners who no longer felt obligated to remain quiet about old grievances. Margaret Coyle led Earth's delegation through most of these negotiations personally, and I was fortunate enough to remain close to her team throughout the process, watching her navigate rooms full of delegates who had spent generations assuming Earth would always be the smallest voice at the table. She never raised her voice either, not once. In all the sessions I witnessed, she simply repeated, patiently, the same principle Earth had carried since the moment we invoked the clause: equal standing or no standing at all. The new charter that eventually emerged from those months of negotiation looked very different from the one Earth had originally signed 30 years earlier. Provisional status was eliminated entirely, not only for Earth, but for every species still classified under that outdated designation. Voting rights, once withheld under the excuse of unfamiliarity with Concordat customs, were extended immediately and permanently. Safety limits disguised as protective guidance were replaced with a framework that allowed every member species to develop at whatever pace its own leadership determined, free from quiet restriction imposed by larger, more established powers. The Vashtar hegemony, for its part, agreed to a series of reparative measures aimed at correcting decades of unequal trade terms, particularly with smaller species like the Ilvex, whose agricultural systems had been quietly limited for years by agreements favoring larger fleets. Doran Ilth attended the final signing ceremony himself, standing not far from where Grace and I were seated, and I remember him catching my eye across the room, offering the same quiet nod he had given me outside the chamber all those months earlier. I will admit the process was never as smooth as I have made it sound while recounting it now. There were difficult weeks where negotiations nearly broke down entirely, particularly when several Vashtar-aligned delegations argued that Earth's methods had been too aggressive, too sudden, too disruptive to a system that had functioned, in their words, peacefully for generations. Grace responded to that argument once, in a session I still remember clearly, by asking exactly whose peace they were referring to, since peace built on quiet inequality had never truly included everyone it claimed to protect. There were also moments of genuine tension that none of us in the diplomatic corps enjoyed living through. Earth's newly revealed defense capability, once fully visible to every species in the region, created a period of real unease among powers who had never imagined we possessed anything beyond modest, treaty-limited resources. Colonel Peter Lindquist was brought into several sessions specifically to reassure nervous delegations that Earth's strength had been developed for the purpose of standing as an equal, not for expanding influence beyond what fairness required. It took time, patience, and repeated demonstration of good faith before that unease began to soften into something closer to cautious respect. Not every species came to see Earth's actions favorably, even after the new charter was signed. Some delegations, particularly those who had benefited most from the old, unequal order, continued to view humanity as reckless, a species that had gambled everything on a single bold move rather than pursuing change through slower, more traditional means. I understood their perspective, even when I disagreed with it. Change of the kind Earth had forced into motion rarely arrives gently, and there were certainly risks involved that could have ended very differently had Earth's quiet preparation over those 30 years been even slightly less thorough. But for every delegation that viewed us with suspicion, there were several more who viewed Earth with something closer to gratitude. Species who had spent generations believing that dignity within the Concordat was simply not available to anyone without the size and history of the largest founding powers. Watching Earth prove otherwise had given many of them the courage to finally ask for what had always been rightfully theirs. I think often about the day Sosrek Vantal mocked us in that chamber, about the laughter that followed his words, and about how certain everyone in that room seemed that Earth would simply absorb the insult the way we always had. I think about how none of them understood that 30 years of quiet endurance had never been weakness at all, but preparation, patient and deliberate, for the exact moment we would finally choose not to endure anymore. The final council session I attended as part of this story took place almost exactly 1 year after that original day of mockery. The chamber looked much the same as it always had, the same domed ceiling painted with founding crests, though Earth's crest had been resized and repositioned during the charter revision, no longer tucked near the bottom edge among the newest members, but placed among the founding powers where it had always belonged, even if nobody had been willing to admit that until now. I stood at the podium one final time that day, not to deliver a ledger of grievances or a formal reckoning, but simply to cast Earth's first official vote as a full member of the Concordat, on a matter concerning trade regulation between three neighboring systems. It was a small, almost unremarkable vote in the larger context of everything that had happened over the previous year, but I remember my hand trembling slightly as I raised it, because I understood exactly how much it had cost, and how much patience it had taken, for that simple gesture to finally mean something. Grace stood beside me as she always had, and after the vote was recorded, she leaned over and said quietly that this was the moment she had been waiting for, since long before I ever arrived at the station, longer than I had known her at all. She said she had spent years absorbing insults in that chamber, believing quietly that one day it would matter, one day the patience would be worth something, even when it felt, in the hardest moments, like it never would be. I looked around the chamber that day, at delegations from a dozen species who had once laughed at us, now sitting in careful, respectful silence as Earth's vote was recorded alongside theirs, equal in weight, equal in standing, no longer provisional, no longer waiting for permission to matter. I thought about my grandmother again, the same thought that had come to me on the night everything began, sitting alone in that thin-walled communication room, reading a single word sent from Earth in the middle of the night. She used to tell me that dignity was never something you asked for. It was something you decided you already had, whether anyone else agreed or not. It took 30 years of quiet patience, one bold and unshakable decision, and a single word sent across the stars in the middle of the night. But on that final day in the chamber, standing among equals for the first time in Earth's history among the stars, I finally understood exactly what she meant. We had never been the loudest species to crawl out of a gravity well. We had simply been the most patient one, waiting for the exact moment silence would finally speak louder than every insult that came before it.